In the heart of Arizona's unforgiving canyons, a little girl heard a cry, a desperate whisper lost in the wind. Frozen by fear, scarred by loss, she stood face to face with a forgotten hero. A German shepherd chained and left to die. But what happened next? It wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of a bond forged in fire, a fight against darkness, and a journey that would save an entire town. If you believe even the most broken souls can rise again, this story is for you. Winter had descended upon Silverwood, a small desert town, resting against the rugged cliffs of the Grand Canyon's lesser-known trails. Though Arizona was known for its blistering summers, the canyons during winter became treacherous, with sharp, icy winds slicing through narrow rock corridors and a thin frost layering the ground like a brittle, forgotten memory. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the canyon walls, painting the landscape in shades of gold and melancholy gray. Sophia Miller, a delicate girl of 7, stood on the edge of Raven's Hollow, a jagged split in the earth where the cliffs whispered secrets through every gust of wind. Her soft chestnut hair fluttered against her pale cheeks, and her hazel eyes, unusually deep for a child her age, scanned the horizon with a wary kind of knowing. She wore a faded blue coat, 2 sizes too big, the sleeves nearly swallowing her tiny hands. This coat had belonged to her father, who perished a year ago in the great wildfire that scarred not just the forests, but also her young heart. Since that day she'd spoken little, her words locked away with the scent of smoke and the image of flames dancing across her memories. As the wind howled low and mournful, Sophia's ears caught something faint, almost drowned by the sighing canyon. It wasn't the groan of shifting rocks or the rustle of dry brush. It was a sound that vibrated with pain, a low, broken whimper lost in the bitter air. Her body stiffened, and instinctively she took a cautious step closer to the edge, boots crunching over frost-laden gravel. From the shadowed crevice below, barely visible through the jagged rocks and thorny brambles, she saw him. A large German shepherd, his once proud frame, now gaunt and trembling, was collapsed against a stone outcrop. His thick fur, matted with ice and dirt, bore the proud remnants of a dog bred for duty, for courage, but those days had long since slipped away. Around his powerful neck, a rusted chain dug deep into the skin, leaving raw, angry wounds. Blood had dried against the coarse fur, a cruel reminder of the neglect he had suffered. His eyes, oh, those eyes met Sophia's with a quiet, pleading resignation. Dark and clouded with pain, yet somewhere in their depths, the flicker of life still remained. Sophia's heart clenched, her small fingers tightening around the frayed edges of her father's coat. The fear that had ruled her life since the fire tried to rise, but this time something stronger pushed it down. With trembling hands, she turned on her heel and ran faster than she had moved in months toward the weathered shopfront where her grandmother worked. Margaret Miller, a stoic woman of 62, had spent most of her life blending the ancient herbal traditions of the local Navajo tribes with modern remedies. Tall and lean, with silver hair always pulled tightly into a braid down her back, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had endured life's hardest storms. Her face was lined with years of both joy and sorrow, and her gray eyes held the calm of desert skies before a storm. Since the death of her son, she had dedicated every waking hour to caring for Sophia and tending her little herbal shop, Desert Remedies, where the air was perpetually scented with sage and lavender. When Sophia burst through the door, her chest heaving with exertion, Margaret immediately noticed the rare spark of urgency in her granddaughter's normally distant eyes. Before Sophia could even catch her breath, she stammered out, "Grandma, there's a dog, hurt, in the canyon." Margaret didn't waste a moment. Despite her age, she moved with practiced efficiency, grabbing a thick wool blanket and a small pouch of medicinal salves made from juniper and aloe. "Come on, child," she said with a voice both gentle and commanding. But before they could step out, the door swung open again and Emily Rose entered. At 30, Emily was one of the youngest female rangers ever assigned to Silverwood. She was tall and athletic, with sun-kissed skin and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back in a functional ponytail beneath her ranger's hat, and her uniform still bore faint marks of her recent patrol. Known for her fiery spirit and unyielding sense of justice, Emily had grown up in Silverwood and returned after college to protect the land she loved. "What's going on?" she asked instantly, noting the alarm in Margaret's expression. "There's a dog down near Raven's Hollow. Bad shape," Margaret answered quickly. Without hesitation, Emily pulled her radio from her belt and called in for backup before turning to Sophia. "Can you show us where?" Sophia nodded. For the first time in a long while, she found her voice steadier than she expected. "I remember the path." With the sun slipping lower and the canyon falling into an early dusk, the three made their way toward Raven's Hollow. The cold bit harder as the wind funneled through the narrow paths, and every step closer seemed to make the air heavier with dread. When they reached the spot, the dog had barely moved. Ranger's breathing was shallow, his flanks barely rising and falling under the thin layer of ice that clung to his fur. Emily knelt beside him, first her professional exterior, cracking just slightly when she saw the state of his wounds. "God, he's been out here for days," she muttered. Her gloved hands worked quickly to examine him, careful not to cause more pain. Margaret spread the blanket over the dog's trembling body, while Sophia knelt close, her small hand reaching out to touch his ear gently. "You're going to be okay?" she whispered, her voice soft but filled with promise. Ranger's ear twitched at her touch, and for the first time his tail moved ever so slightly, a weak but undeniable thump against the frozen earth. Together, they lifted him carefully, his weight more burdened by the weight of his suffering than by his size alone. As they made their slow journey back toward the town, the first snowflakes of the evening began to fall, dotting the air like fragile pieces of hope. By the time they reached Desert Remedies, the fire had been lit and the little shop had become a makeshift sanctuary. Ranger lay wrapped in warm blankets, the worst of his wounds cleaned and tended with Margaret's careful hands. Emily sat nearby, contacting the local vet, while Sophia remained at Ranger's side, whispering stories of brave warriors and loyal guardians, stories her father used to tell her before bedtime. And though the storm outside continued to rage within the small shop on the edge of Silverwood, a fragile warmth began to grow, one that neither fire nor fear could extinguish. The wind had settled into a mournful hush by the time they reached the old Ranger station. Once a proud outpost overlooking the northern expanse of the Grand Canyon, it now stood weathered and forgotten, its timber walls faded by sun and time. A crooked wooden sign still clung to rusted chains above the entrance, reading "Silverwood Lookout," though several letters had long since fallen away. Inside, Logan Grant sat alone by the cold stone hearth, staring into the darkened fireplace. At 34, Logan carried the presence of a man much older, his broad shoulders often hunched, as if the weight of his own regrets pressed them downward. His dark brown hair, grown longer than military regulation ever allowed, fell loosely over his forehead, and a scruffy beard lined his square jaw. His steel-gray eyes, once sharp and commanding, had dulled over the years, clouded by memories he couldn't escape. Since the great wildfire 2 years ago, the fire that took the lives of 6 people, including Sophia's father, Daniel Miller, Logan had withdrawn from the world, haunted by the mission he failed to complete, and the dog he left behind. Ranger had been his partner, his closest companion in those days, and the thought of his loyal friend lost and suffering had become a silent torment. When the door swung open and the bitter air rushed inside, Logan turned sharply, his hand instinctively brushing against the faded rescue badge he still kept pinned beneath his jacket. Emily Rose stepped in, first her green eyes flicking across the room with practiced ease before softening slightly when they landed on Logan. Emily hadn't changed much since their last mission together. Her tall, lean frame moved with purpose, and though her face remained youthful, there was a certain weariness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She had always been the fearless one, bold, compassionate, and unafraid to call Logan out when his sense of duty turned into self-destruction. But after the wildfire, after losing Daniel, and seeing the devastation left behind, even Emily had retreated, throwing herself into solitary patrols along the canyon's treacherous ridges. Behind her came Margaret and Sophia, with the frail, battered body of Ranger wrapped tightly in blankets. Logan stood, his eyes locking on the familiar markings of the German Shepherd, despite the grime and matted fur. His breath caught. "Ranger," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. At the sound of his name, Ranger stirred weakly, his ears twitching, but his body too weak to rise. The sight nearly brought Logan to his knees. He moved forward cautiously, as if afraid that approaching too quickly might shatter the fragile moment. "Let's get him warm," Emily said, her voice taking on that commanding edge Logan remembered well. "Sophia helped me gather towels. Margaret, there's a first aid kit in the storage room. Logan, get the fire going." Logan hesitated. The fireplace. It had remained cold and empty since the last winter, its hearth as abandoned as his own will to confront the past. He swallowed hard, knelt and began stacking kindling with practiced but shaky hands. As the flames caught and the fire crackled to life, a loud pop from the burning wood echoed through the room. At that sound, Ranger flinched violently, his body twisting despite his injuries. His breathing became rapid, eyes darting frantically toward the fire. Logan recoiled, guilt tightening his chest. Sophia, unnoticed until that moment, moved closer to Ranger's side. She gently laid her small hand on his quivering head, her fingers stroking through the coarse, blood-matted fur with surprising calm. "You're safe now," she whispered, her voice so soft it barely rose above the fire's crackle. The dog's breathing began to slow under her touch. Margaret returned with a pouch of healing salves made from desert herbs, her face set in quiet concentration as she knelt to examine Ranger's wounds. Emily crossed her arms, standing a few feet away, eyes fixed on Logan. "You never told anyone you survived that night," she said quietly. Logan didn't look up, didn't think anyone wanted to hear it. "You left us all thinking you were dead." Emily replied, her voice a careful mix of accusation and concern. "And Ranger? We thought he was gone too." "I thought he was." Logan's voice cracked, his fists clenching. "He saved me, Emily. During the collapse, he dragged me out of the burning debris. I passed out near the ridge. When I woke up, he was gone." Silence settled over the room, heavy with unspoken grief. Sophia, still sitting close to Ranger, began to hum. It was a lullaby her father used to sing, a tune lost to the winds but preserved in her fragile memories. As the melody drifted through the cabin, Ranger's breathing steadied further. His body, though still tense, relaxed just enough for Margaret to clean his wounds. Night fell quietly over Silverwood. The storm had passed, but a cold clarity settled in its place. Stars glittered sharply against the deep black sky. Inside the ranger station, for the first time in years, the hearth glowed warmly, casting long shadows and faint light across the old wooden beams. Logan sat apart from the others, staring into the fire he'd once feared to light. Across from him, Emily leaned against the window, her gaze lost in the distance. Margaret had fallen asleep in a chair near Ranger, and Sophia lay curled on a blanket beside the dog, her hand still resting on his side. Outside, the canyon slept, but within these walls old wounds had begun, however slightly, to heal. Morning broke over Silverwood in a hesitant glow, the first golden rays fighting through the lingering frost and fog that clung to the canyon walls. Thin wisps of mist curled around the jagged rocks like fading ghosts, reluctant to release their hold on the night. Inside the old ranger station, the embers of the previous night's fire still glowed faintly, casting soft warmth across the worn floorboards. Sophia was the first to rise. Her small frame shivered despite the heavy blanket wrapped around her shoulders as she sat beside Ranger, who lay quietly, his breathing slow but steady. The fire's glow reflected faintly off something dull and metallic nestled beneath the matted fur on his neck. Curious, Sophia gently pushed the fur aside and discovered a small, rusted tag dangling from a frayed leather strap. The metal was corroded, but as she rubbed it clean with her sleeve, faint letters and numbers emerged: Unit 27, Operation Canyon Flame. The strange inscription puzzled her. She had never heard of such an operation, and yet something about the words felt important, dangerous even. Carefully tucking the tag back beneath Ranger's fur, she resolved to find out the truth. Later that morning, Logan stood outside the station, leaning against one of the thick support beams, his gaze lost across the expanse of the canyon. The wind was calmer today, the air still crisp, but without the biting chill of the night before. His mind wandered to the fires, too many of them, too perfectly timed, each leaving a corridor of devastation, suspiciously close to abandoned mining trails and hidden crevices within the cliffs. As he stood there, lost in thought, Emily approached from the winding trail. She carried herself with the grace of someone who had spent her life outdoors, her movements deliberate and light-footed. Today she wore her ranger's jacket unzipped, revealing a faded gray t-shirt tucked into rugged jeans. Her boots, scuffed from years of patrol, crunched softly against the gravel. "You've seen it too, haven't you?" Emily asked quietly, joining Logan at the overlook. Logan didn't turn to her. "The fires," he said simply. "They're no accident." Emily nodded, her expression darkening. 3 last season. all blamed on lightning or carelessness. But the patterns don't add up. Each one started near known smuggling routes, and every time the fires conveniently forced search teams away from key areas. Logan's jaw clenched. They're moving something through the canyon, using the chaos as cover. Back inside, Sophia sat at the old wooden desk in the corner of the ranger station, flipping through a tattered journal she had found among her father's belongings, stored away by her grandmother. Daniel Miller had once been a respected ranger himself, tall and broad-shouldered, with a gentle kindness that belied his imposing frame. He had always carried a leather-bound notebook, where he documented every trail, every strange sighting, and every gut feeling he couldn't quite explain. Sophia turned the brittle pages until she found something that made her pause. Operation Canyon Flame. Her father had written those exact words. The entry was brief, almost as if he'd been interrupted mid-thought. Met with LH today. Concerns over new fire patterns confirmed. Smuggling activity suspected. Ranger unit deployed for observation. Will follow up tomorrow. Sophia's heart skipped. LH. It had to be Logan. Gathering her courage, she approached the doorway where Logan and Emily stood. The morning light framed her small figure, and for the first time since her father's death, her voice rang out clear and steady. Logan. What was Operation Canyon Flame? Logan turned, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment he said nothing, then slowly nodded for her to join them by the overlook. It was a mission, he began, his voice low and rough. 2 years ago, after the fires started spreading in strange patterns, your father and I, along with a special K-9 unit, were assigned to investigate. Ranger was part of that unit. We discovered evidence of smugglers moving shipments through the canyon, but before we could act, everything went wrong. Sophia listened intently, her hands tightening around the journal. There was a trap. Logan continued, his eyes distant. The fires that day weren't wild. They were set deliberately to trap us. Your father stayed behind to help others escape. I barely made it out. Emily crossed her arms, her jaw tight. And those responsible vanished before anyone could bring them to justice. But they're still out there. Sophia's small voice broke the heavy silence. And Ranger, he was left behind too. Logan's face hardened with regret. He saved my life, Sophia. Pulled me from the fire and pushed me toward the river trail. I was unconscious before help arrived. When I woke up, he was gone. Sophia knelt beside Ranger again, her fingers brushing gently against his worn leather collar. He found his way back, she whispered. He survived. Emily turned to Logan, her expression resolute. If they're still out there using the canyon, it's time we finish what we started. Logan nodded grimly. But this time, we're not going in unprepared. As the sun rose higher over Silverwood, a new determination settled among them. The ghosts of the past had returned, but this time they were ready to face them. And at the center of it all stood a battered but unbroken German shepherd, his loyalty unshaken despite the scars he bore. The late afternoon sun bled into the canyon skies, painting the jagged cliffs with streaks of amber and burnt crimson. Silverwood's narrow trails glowed faintly under the fading light, and the air felt charged as if the land itself held its breath. High above dark clouds gathered ominously, a sure sign that one of Arizona's infamous flash storms was about to unleash its fury. Sophia stood at the edge of the old trail, known as Widow's Pass, a narrow path carved precariously into the side of the canyon wall. Her small figure, bundled in a thick olive-green jacket and a knit scarf nearly swallowing her chin, seemed dwarfed by the vastness around her. But her hazel eyes held a fierce determination, a spark of her father's courage lighting them from within. Clutched in her mittened hand was his old leather journal, now weathered and soft at the edges from her constant grip. Beside her stood Ranger, his sturdy frame, alert dark fur, rippling slightly in the cool wind. Though his body still bore the marks of past suffering, thin scars beneath his thick coat and a faint limp in his right hind leg, his posture was proud. His intelligent eyes scanned the horizon, ears pricked toward the faint echoes that seemed to rise from the canyon's depths. Sophia glanced down at the journal, her small finger tracing the faded map sketched on one of the final pages. Her father's hurried notes mentioned a cave hidden just beyond Widow's Pass, a place he had suspected held not only the key to uncovering the smuggler's trail, but also the reason for the mysterious fires. That cave was where he had last been seen alive. "Come on, Ranger," she whispered, her voice trembling only slightly. "Let's finish this." The trail narrowed dangerously as they pressed on loose gravel, slipping beneath their feet. Ranger moved ahead, his instincts guiding him where Sophia's eyes could not. Minutes turned into hours as the sky darkened and distant thunder rumbled like a warning drum. Suddenly, Ranger stopped, his body rigid, tail stiff. He turned his head and let out a low, warning growl. Up ahead, hidden behind a curtain of thorny brush, loomed the entrance to the cave just as the journal had promised. It yawned open like the mouth of some ancient beast, darkness, swallowing the light just a few steps beyond the threshold. Sophia hesitated. Memories surged, unbidden flashes of roaring flames, choking smoke, and the helpless feeling of being trapped. Her hands shook, and for a moment she could not force her feet to move forward. Ranger padded back to her side, nudging her hand gently with his muzzle. His eyes held no fear, only quiet reassurance. With a trembling breath, Sophia took the first step inside. The air grew colder, dampness clinging to her skin. Water dripped steadily from somewhere deep within the cavern, echoing in the oppressive silence. She used a small flashlight, its narrow beam struggling against the suffocating darkness. Ranger stayed close, his shoulder brushing against her leg as they moved deeper into the cave. Without warning, a sharp crack split the air above. Thunder boomed, and the ground beneath their feet trembled faintly. Outside, the storm had arrived in full force. Then came the sound that made Sophia's blood turn to ice, the low, distant roar of rushing water. Flash flood. Panic surged through her, but before she could act, a violent rush of icy water thundered into the cave entrance, cutting off their retreat. The current swept toward them, carrying debris and mud. Ranger lunged forward, planting himself between Sophia and the surging water. His powerful body took the brunt of the force as he pushed against her, guiding her toward a narrow ledge just above the waterline. Sophia scrambled onto the ledge, her fingers raw and bleeding from gripping the jagged stone. Ranger leaped up beside her, his soaked fur clinging to his muscular frame, his sides heaving with the effort of keeping them both safe. Trapped. Cold. In utter darkness. Tears welled in Sophia's eyes, her old fear rising like the floodwaters beneath them. But then through the deafening rush of water, she heard Ranger's steady breathing beside her, felt the warmth of his body pressed close. Slowly she reached for his collar, her fingers brushing against the familiar metal tag. It reminded her of everything Ranger had endured and survived. Taking a shuddering breath, she closed her eyes and began to sing. It was the same lullaby her father had sung to calm her during thunderstorms, the same melody she had hummed for Ranger when he'd first come back to her. Her voice, soft and wavering, at first grew steadier with each verse. Meanwhile, back at the ranger station, Logan stood over a detailed topographical map spread across the main table. Emily paced behind him, her boots tapping anxiously against the wooden floor. "She's out there, Logan, and that storm's going to turn the lower canyon trails into death traps." Emily snapped, her usual calm, replaced by thinly veiled panic. Logan, his jaw tight and eyes blazing with purpose for the first time in years, grabbed his pack and a heavy-duty flashlight. "We don't have time to wait for backup. We move now." He stepped out into the storm rain, pelting his face as he pushed toward the trail. His mind raced through every memory, every inch of the canyon he once knew like the back of his hand. This time, he wouldn't fail. Not Sophia. Not again. With Emily at his side, and a small search team of local volunteers among them, a burly ex-miner named Hank Remy. Known for his unshakable nerves and deep knowledge of the canyon's lesser-known paths, they pressed forward against the storm. Hank, a man in his 50s with a broad chest, thick arms, and a permanent layer of dust on his weathered face, had once been a legend among canyon explorers. Despite his gruff exterior and sharp tongue, his heart was soft when it came to children and animals, having lost his own daughter to illness years before. As the team navigated the treacherous trails, Logan's sharp eyes caught signs. Others might have missed a fresh set of small boot prints, half washed away by the rising water, and deep paw marks that spoke of Ranger's presence. His heart thudded painfully against his ribs. They were close. Back in the cave, the floodwaters had started to recede slightly, but the air grew colder, and Sophia's voice had long since faded into silence. She curled against Ranger, exhausted. Just as her eyes began to drift shut, a distant beam of light flickered through the darkness. Sophia Logan's voice, strong and sure, echoed through the cavern. Relief washed over her tears, springing fresh as she clung to Ranger. Logan and Hank appeared moments later, their flashlights cutting through the black. Logan dropped to his knees, gathering Sophia in his arms, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now," he whispered. Hank leaned down, his rough hands brushing over Ranger's soaked fur. "That's one fine, brave dog you've got there," he muttered, his voice soft despite the gravelly tone. They led them out slowly, the storm still raging, but hope burning brighter than any storm could snuff out. The air of Silverwood buzzed with anticipation as twilight settled over the town. Along the winding main street, lanterns swayed gently in the breeze, their golden glow flickering against the encroaching darkness. Tonight marked the annual Festival of Lights, a cherished tradition meant to honor the endurance of the town's pioneers and to cast symbolic light against the shadows of the past year. Children ran freely along the cobbled paths, their laughter mingling with the melodies of a small string quartet playing near the town square. Stalls lined the streets, offering everything from sweet cinnamon rolls to handcrafted Navajo ornaments. Lanterns shaped like stars, moons and mythical creatures dangled above the crowds, each one meticulously lit by volunteers. Sophia stood near the entrance of the square, her small fingers wrapped tightly around Ranger's collar as they weaved through the gathered townsfolk. She wore a soft, cream-colored sweater beneath her worn jacket, her cheeks pink from the crisp night air. Ranger walked proudly at her side, his fur brushed clean. His movement steady despite the lingering stiffness in his leg. His ears flicked back and forth, his nose lifted slightly to taste every scent drifting through the festival. Margaret stood nearby, chatting warmly with old friends near her herbal remedies stall. She had dressed for the occasion in a flowing indigo shawl embroidered with silver threads, her long gray hair left loose for the first time in years. A serene smile softened her usually stern face, though her eyes flicked often toward Sophia, protective even in peace. Emily moved through the crowd, like a shadow her ranger's uniform exchanged for a dark leather jacket and jeans. Though she appeared relaxed, her sharp green eyes constantly scanned the crowd. Logan stood at the edge of the square, his tall frame leaning casually against a lamppost, but his gaze was sharp, tracking every unfamiliar face. It was Sophia who first noticed the men. A group of 3 lingered near the outer edge of the festival, their clothes too heavy for the mild cold, their eyes shifting constantly under the brims of their low-slung hats. One of them, a lean man with a hooked nose and a faint scar along his left cheek, kept his gloved hand tucked inside his coat pocket. Ranger stiffened beside her, a low growl rumbling in his chest. His sharp nose picked up a faint acrid scent beneath the sweet aromas of roasted chestnuts and spiced cider, an unmistakable chemical tang. Sophia's heart quickened. Without hesitation, she tugged Ranger toward Logan. Breathless, she grabbed his sleeve and pointed toward the shadowed figures. "Logan!" Ranger smells something bad. Like smoke, but sharper. Logan's face hardened instantly. He pressed his fingers to his earpiece, signaling Emily. Within moments, she materialized at his side, eyes locked on the men Sophia had pointed out. "That's them," Logan muttered, the same pattern as before. Heavy coats too calm for festival crowds positioned near the southern exit. Emily nodded. "We'll need to check for explosives. We can't cause a panic, at least not until we know for sure." As if understanding the gravity of the moment, Ranger pulled gently free from Sophia's grip and began moving toward the men, his movements low and deliberate. Sophia watched anxiously as Logan and Emily followed behind him at a calculated distance. Ranger approached the group under the cover of the gathering crowd. His body language was calm but alert, his nose working furiously. Then he stopped abruptly, his body tense, his head turning toward a set of stacked supply crates near the edge of the square. He let out a short, sharp bark. Emily and Logan moved in. Logan approached the crates first, his trained hands carefully inspecting them. Hidden behind a loose wooden panel, he found a collection of small canisters wired together, improvised incendiary devices, their triggers connected to a remote detonator. Emily's voice cut through the growing tension, low and firm. "They're planning to start another fire, right here, right now." Logan's jaw clenched. They wanted to set the forest ablaze under cover of the festival, draw everyone's attention here while they moved their shipments through the canyon trails. Before they could act, the man with the scar caught sight of the scene unfolding. He turned to flee toward the southern trail. Logan was already moving, his legs pounding against the cobbled stone as he pursued the figure into the darkness beyond the festival lights. Ranger lunged after them with surprising speed. Despite his earlier injuries, his powerful legs propelling him forward like a shadow reborn. Back at the festival, Emily and a group of town deputies moved in to secure the remaining suspects. Among them was Sheriff Warren Tate, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, his silver hair combed neatly beneath his official Stetson. His public persona was one of integrity and order, but his eyes held the cold sharpness of a man used to controlling situations from behind closed doors. Sophia, hiding behind a nearby stall, watched as Sheriff Tate approached Emily with a practiced tight-lipped smile. Everything under control, Ranger rose. He asked, his voice smooth but edged with quiet authority. Emily didn't blink. "We found devices hidden under the supply crates, Sheriff. If Ranger hadn't alerted us in time, this entire square could have gone up in flames." Tate's expression didn't falter. "Well, that's concerning, isn't it?" He turned his gaze toward Sophia, then his eyes lingering a moment too long before moving back to Emily. "I trust you'll handle this quietly. No need to disrupt a good festival night." Emily's jaw tightened. "We'll handle it, Sheriff. You can be sure of that." Meanwhile, in the darkness beyond the town's edge, Logan chased the scarred man through the underbrush. The figure moved with desperation, stumbling over rocks and low-hanging branches. Logan pressed forward, closing the distance. Then, without warning, the man turned sharply, drawing a concealed pistol from his jacket. Before he could aim, a low growl echoed through the darkness, and Ranger lunged his powerful body, slamming into the man's side, knocking him to the ground. The weapon skittered out of reach, and Logan was there in seconds, pinning the man down. In the moonlight, Logan finally saw the man's face clearly. Victor Kane, a well-known enforcer for one of the most elusive smuggling rings operating across state lines. Logan breathed heavily, adrenaline coursing through his veins. "It's over, Kane," he said grimly. "You're done running." The desert wind howled like a mournful spirit over the Grand Canyon, its voice echoing through the sheer cliffs and vast emptiness that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. The moon hung low and full, casting a pale glow over the jagged ridges and painting the canyon floor with ghostly light. Above, storm clouds loomed in the distance, their edges illuminated by occasional flashes of distant lightning, a silent warning of chaos brewing both in the skies and in the hearts of men. Sophia stood nervously at the edge of the festival grounds, her fingers clenched tightly around the worn leather strap of Ranger's collar. Despite the night's earlier triumph, unease settled deep in her chest. Logan and Emily had intercepted the smuggler's plan, but something still felt unfinished, like a storm waiting to break loose. Unbeknownst to them, Victor Kane had not acted alone. High above the canyon, hidden in the dense shadow of a long-abandoned fire lookout, another figure observed everything. His name was Silas Creed, a name spoken in hushed tones across the underworld. Silas was a tall, gaunt man, with sunken cheeks and piercing ice-blue eyes that seemed to look straight through people. His sharp features were made more menacing by a jagged scar running from his temple down to the corner of his mouth, a remnant from a violent past he wore with pride. Known for his ruthlessness and cold precision, Silas was the real mastermind behind the smuggling operations plaguing Silverwood and beyond. Silas crouched beside a rusted telescope mounted on the rickety remains of the lookout, watching the town with the practiced patience of a predator. His gloved fingers toyed absently with a silver lighter, engraved with the symbol of a phoenix rising from flames. Below, Sophia had grown restless. She whispered softly to Ranger, who stood alert at her side, his ears pricked and his powerful body tense. A low growl rumbled from his chest, and before she could react, he took off toward the southern cliffs, his powerful legs propelling him into the night. "Ranger, wait," she called, fear tightening her throat as she ran after him. Near the edge of the Grand Canyon, the trail narrowed into a dangerous path, overlooking a deadly drop. Ranger halted near the cliff's edge, his eyes locked on a figure standing motionless against the darkness, Silas Creed himself. Silas stepped forward, the silver lighter flickering in his palm, casting eerie reflections across his scarred face. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice smooth and low-laced with malice. "The brave little girl and her loyal hound. You've become quite the troublemakers." Before Sophia could retreat, Silas lunged forward with surprising speed, grabbing her by the arm and yanking her roughly toward the cliff's edge. Ranger growled and advanced, his teeth bared, but Silas pressed the cold metal of a concealed revolver against Sophia's temple, halting the dog mid-step. One more move, and she goes over. Silas hissed, his grip tightening painfully around Sophia's small wrist. From the shadows behind them, Logan and Emily emerged, their weapons drawn, their faces grim. Logan shouted, stepping carefully forward, his stance wide and steady despite the treacherous ground. Silas sneered. "You're too late, Logan. You always were." His finger hovered near the trigger, and the storm above began to break, distant thunder rolling closer. In that split second, Ranger made his choice. With a powerful surge of muscle and instinct, he launched himself at Silas, his body a blur against the night sky. The gun fired a sharp crack that echoed across the canyon. Sophia screamed, the sound lost in the roar of the wind. Ranger collided with Silas, driving the man backward. His jaws clamped down on Silas's wrist, forcing the gun from his grasp. But the momentum carried them both dangerously close to the cliff's edge. Silas staggered, one foot slipping over the ledge. Logan rushed forward, grabbing Sophia and pulling her to safety just as Ranger and Silas tumbled over the precipice. Ranger Sophia's cry pierced the storm. Logan and Emily scrambled to the edge, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Far below, they spotted a narrow outcropping barely visible in the moonlight, where Ranger lay motionless, his body sprawled against the unforgiving stone. Silas's figure was nowhere to be seen, lost to the depths of the canyon. Emily immediately radioed for a rescue team, while Logan tied off a rope to a nearby tree. Against every warning in his head, he began lowering himself toward the outcropping, his hands raw against the coarse rope. Sophia knelt at the cliff's edge, tears streaming down her cheeks, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, you have to save him. Please don't let him go." Logan reached Ranger's side minutes later, his chest tightening at the sight of the dog's shallow breathing. Ranger's side was slick with blood from a deep gash along his ribs, and his breathing was ragged. But when Logan placed a trembling hand on his shoulder, Ranger's eyes fluttered open and his tail thumped weakly against the stone. "You stubborn old soldier," Logan muttered, his throat tight with emotion. "You're not done yet." With practiced care, Logan secured Ranger in a makeshift harness and began the arduous climb back to safety. Emily and a rescue team hauled them up, inch by agonizing inch, the storm raging overhead. When they finally reached the top, Sophia threw herself against Ranger, her small hands cradling his battered head. "You saved me," she whispered through sobs. "You always save me." And as the first drops of rain began to fall, washing away the blood and dust, the bond between a girl and her dog burned brighter than any storm could ever extinguish. A gray dawn broke over Silverwood, the light hesitant, as if the sun itself was afraid to rise after the night's violent reckoning. Mist clung low to the streets, curling through the alleys and along the canyon's jagged cliffs. The storm had passed, but its aftermath left a heavy silence, a shared exhaustion that settled over the hearts of every soul in the town. Under a hastily assembled canvas tent near the town square, a makeshift field clinic buzzed with quiet urgency. Tables were arranged in a semicircle, covered in whatever clean linens the townspeople could provide. Lanterns swung gently from the overhead beams, their soft glow barely holding back the gloom. At the center of it, all on a battered wooden table, lay Ranger. His powerful body, so often a symbol of unbreakable will, now seemed small and fragile under the weight of blood-soaked bandages. His breathing was shallow, each labored rise and fall of his chest, drawing anxious stares from everyone present. Logan stood by the table, his shoulders hunched against the unbearable sight before him. His weathered hands, calloused from years of field work, trembled as he gently pressed them against Ranger's side, feeling for the weak, fluttering heartbeat beneath battered ribs. His face was a canvas of raw emotion, grief, regret, and a desperate hope he hadn't felt in years. And then, before anyone could stop it, his composure broke. Hot tears welled in his eyes and spilled over tracing silent paths down his unshaven cheeks. Margaret arrived moments later, her tall frame cutting through the tense air like a force of nature. She wore a thick knitted shawl, the color of deep forest green, her long silver hair tied back in a loose braid. Her face, lined and weathered, but fiercely determined, held none of the doubt visible in the others. In her hands she carried a basket of carefully prepared herbal remedies, bundles of dried sage strips of fresh aloe, and small vials filled with dark concentrated oils. Without hesitation, she set to work. Her fingers moved with the steady precision of a healer who had faced death before and refused to bow to it. She ground fresh juniper berries into a thick paste, mixing it with warm water and a touch of lavender oil. The pungent aroma filled the tent. As she applied the mixture to Ranger's wounds, the antiseptic properties of the herbs already beginning to take effect. "Stay with us, boy," Margaret whispered under her breath, her voice low but full of conviction. "You've walked through fire before. You can do it again." Across from her, Emily moved quickly, her sleeves rolled up and her green eyes sharp with focus. Though exhaustion pulled at her features, she worked tirelessly to sterilize the makeshift instruments, her hands steady even as the room seemed to tilt under the weight of uncertainty. Emily had always been known for her fearlessness in the field, but tonight it was her tenderness that held everything together. She cleaned Ranger's wounds with gentle practiced movements, murmuring soothing words under her breath, as if the dog could somehow understand and draw strength from her calm. Outside, the townspeople gathered in hushed clusters. Children clung to their mothers, wide-eyed and silent, while the older residents, many of whom had known Ranger since he was a bright-eyed pup in training, stood with hats in hand and heads bowed. Even Sheriff Warren Tate had made a brief appearance, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat, before slipping back into the shadows as quietly as he had come. Among the crowd stood a new figure. Dr. Samuel Whitmore recently arrived from Flagstaff. He was a tall, lean man in his early 40s, his skin tanned from years spent working in rural communities. His dark hair was streaked with gray at the temples, and a pair of wire-framed glasses perched precariously on the bridge of his nose. Dr. Whitmore had a reputation for taking on the most difficult cases driven by a personal tragedy that shaped his entire career. Years ago, he had lost his wife and child to an epidemic in a remote mountain town. Since then, he had dedicated his life to saving those others might give up on. Stepping inside the tent, he approached Margaret and Emily with quiet authority. "Let me help," he said simply, his voice low and calming. Without waiting for a response, he examined Ranger carefully, his experienced hands confirming the severity of the injuries. "The bleeding's slowed," he murmured. "That's good. But he's lost a lot of blood and shock is setting in. We'll need to keep him warm and hydrated if he has any chance of making it through the next few hours." Sophia stood just inside the tent's entrance, her small hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her wide hazel eyes never left Ranger's battered form, her lips moving silently as she recited every hopeful prayer she knew. Logan crouched beside her, his large hand resting gently on her shoulder. "He's a fighter, Sophia Logan," whispered hoarsely. "Just like you." Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Ranger drifted in and out of consciousness, each shallow breath a fragile thread holding him to the world. Then, as the first light of dawn crept into the tent, a small but undeniable miracle occurred. Ranger's breathing grew stronger, more rhythmic. His tail thumped faintly against the table, and when Sophia approached to stroke his head, his eyes flickered open, locking onto hers, with a familiar, unwavering loyalty. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the tent. Logan dropped his head into his hands, overcome by the release of fear and tension. For the first time in years, he wept openly, not from regret, but from the overwhelming relief that perhaps just this once, hope had won. Margaret pressed a gentle kiss to Sophia's forehead, her tired eyes shining with quiet triumph. Emily leaned against the support beam, a weary but genuine smile tugging at her lips. Outside, as the sun climbed higher over the canyon, the people of Silverwood gathered not in mourning, but in silent gratitude. And within that humble canvas shelter, a battered but unbeaten German shepherd had once again reminded them all that even in the darkest moments, life can rise from hope. The sun rose over the Grand Canyon, like a promise kept gilding the towering cliffs with hues of soft gold and vibrant rose. Light poured into the deepest crevices of the canyons, places where darkness had once reigned, now touched by the warmth of a new day. The air smelled clean-laced with the crisp scent of pine and fresh earth after the long night of storms and sorrow. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the town of Silverwood stood united, not under the weight of fear, but in the joy of justice finally served. Days earlier, with Victor Kane apprehended, and Silas Creed's criminal empire dismantled the investigation, led to the capture of those who had long manipulated the region's vulnerabilities. Even Sheriff Warren Tate, once untouchable behind his polished reputation and cold authority, had been led away in shackles after undeniable evidence surfaced of his complicity in the smuggling network. At the center of the town square, Logan stood tall once more, the stoop of guilt and regret lifted from his broad shoulders. His weathered face bore new lines, but his eyes had regained their steel-gray sharpness, tempered by peace rather than weighed by the past. He wore a new ranger uniform, the badge freshly polished, a symbol not of authority alone, but of hard-earned redemption. Sophia ran across the open field near the canyon's edge, her laughter a bright melody rising above the cliffs. Her long chestnut hair flew wild behind her cheeks glowing with the color of health and happiness. She no longer feared the shadows that crept along the canyon walls, or the sound of crackling fire. Where terror had once silenced her voice, now joy rang out freely. At her side ran Ranger his gait, strong despite the faint limp in his hind leg, a permanent reminder of the sacrifice he had made. His golden-brown coat gleamed in the sunlight, his sharp ears perked forward, his intelligent eyes alert yet calm. Around his neck hung a new collar engraved with a simple message: Guardian, Survivor, Friend. Today marked the official opening of the Guardian's Ridge, the newly restored Canine Rescue and Rehabilitation Center, perched high above the Grand Canyon. Where the old ranger station once stood in disrepair, a beautiful sprawling facility now overlooked the vast, breathtaking expanse. Its rustic architecture blended seamlessly with the surrounding landscape, stone foundations, wide wooden porches, and tall glass windows reflecting the endless sky. Logan had worked tirelessly alongside the townspeople to build it, pouring his heart and redemption into every beam and nail. The Guardian's Ridge wasn't just a sanctuary for dogs. It was a place of healing for children like Sophia, wounded by life's cruelties, and for anyone who had forgotten how to hope. Margaret stood near the entrance, a proud smile softening her stern features. Her long, silver hair was braided neatly over one shoulder, and she wore a flowing indigo dress with traditional Navajo patterns woven into the fabric. Beside her, Dr. Samuel Whitmore leaned against the railing, his calm, observant eyes taking in the celebration. Though his past losses still lingered behind his quiet demeanor, the joy on his face that day spoke of a man who had found his purpose once more among these people. Emily was there too, dressed in a ranger's uniform, crisp with new insignia, the sunlight catching in her auburn hair. She walked the perimeter of the event with her usual grace, her sharp green eyes scanning the crowd. But for once there was no threat to anticipate, only futures to protect. New faces had also come to Silverwood for the ceremony. Among them was Sarah Delgado, a child psychologist from Phoenix, tall and willowy, with kind brown eyes and a voice soft enough to calm even the most frightened child. She had traveled to volunteer her time at Guardian's Ridge, drawn by the extraordinary story of a dog that saved not just lives, but souls. Sarah moved through the gathering with gentle ease, stopping to kneel beside the children, who had already bonded with some of the rescued dogs. Her presence was like a quiet breeze on a hot day, soothing, barely noticed, yet immensely comforting. At the ceremony, Logan stood before the gathered crowd. His voice, once burdened by regret, now rang out clear and proud. Today isn't just about the opening of a new facility. He began, his eyes sweeping across the faces of friends and strangers alike. It's about second chances. It's about the belief that even the most broken among us, whether human or animal, can find their way back to the light. He paused, his gaze lingering on Sophia and Ranger, standing side by side on the ridge above, framed perfectly by the vast canyon behind them. This place will stand as a beacon for every soul searching for hope. And it all began with a little girl's courage and the loyalty of a dog who refused to give up. Cheers erupted from the crowd, and as the sun climbed higher, Sophia stepped forward with Ranger by her side. She held up a small wooden plaque, her voice clear and unwavering. To everyone who has ever been lost, she announced, smiling brightly, "May you find your way here." And with that, the first official day of the Guardian's Ridge began. Children laughed and played with the dogs, some timid and recovering, others full of youthful energy. Ranger, proud and dignified, became the leader of the pack, guiding new dogs through the training courses, standing watch over the most fragile rescues, and offering silent companionship to those still too afraid to trust. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned a deep indigo, Logan stood once more at the edge of the canyon. Sophia beside him, her small hand wrapped in his. "Thank you for bringing me back here," she whispered. Logan's voice was soft, full of wonder. "No, Sophia. Thank you for saving me." And there beneath the endless Arizona sky, they watched as the first stars blinked to life, each one a silent promise that, even in the darkest nights, a new dawn was always waiting. Miracles often come quietly in a loyal dog, a brave child, or a simple act of kindness. Through every struggle, God reminds us that brighter days are ahead and His blessings are never far. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment and tell us how it spoke to you. And if you believe in second chances and quiet miracles, type Amen below. Subscribe for more stories of hope, and may God bless you and those who walk beside you.